Welcome, everyone. Sorry, I put my transcript to the side. Good afternoon and welcome to RosieCon Book Festival. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Diane Rogers, and I am the school librarian at Ben Davis Ninth Grade Center in Indianapolis, Indiana, and the founding member of RosieCon Book Festival. I'm very pleased that you've decided to join us today for our festival's first author panel for the 2022-2023 school year. RosieCon chooses which books and authors to invite to the festival based upon the titles each year that are on the Elliott Rosewater, Indiana High School book list. All authors and illustrators for the 25 titles are invited to participate. For various reasons, usually scheduling conflicts, it isn't always possible for all invitees to attend. And in case you didn't know, the Rosewater list is a recommended reading list of contemporary titles for Indiana teenagers. The list is renewed and refreshed every school year with new and exciting books and is sponsored by the Indiana Library Federation. Near the end of every school year, teens from across the state will vote for their favorite book, and the winning title is then given the Rosewater Award. Voting is online and is currently open. So go to rosiebookaward.com, that is ROSIE bookaward.com, and you can vote for your favorite titles on the Rosewater list. Voting is open through the first week of May every school year. Before I give the microphones and the cameras over to our author and our moderator, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors for this book festival. Money and support has been provided by the Lilly Endowment for the Arts, the Indianapolis Foundation Library Fund, and my school district, Wayne Township Schools. Without the support of these organizations, RosieCon Book Festival would not be possible, and we are beginning our 5th year this year. All right, enough introduction, audience. Let's begin today's panel. I want to introduce our moderator for today, Rachel Milburn. Rachel is the Teen Services Manager for the Frankfort Community Public Library in Frankfort, Indiana. Welcome, Rachel. It's great to have you with us today. Take it away.
Thank you. I would like to introduce our author for today, Alyssa, who is the New York Times best-selling author of several novels for young adults, including The Castle School for Troubled Girls and What Kind of Girl, and A Danger to Herself and Others, and Faceless. Alyssa is the co-author of The Haunting of Sunshine Girl. Alyssa grew up in Northern California and New York and attended Barnard College. She currently lives in and writes in New York. Alyssa, one thing I wanted to ask you was, how do I pronounce your last name? Because after reading the book, I know that Moira, she wants her name pronounced correctly.
Yes, it's Sheinmel.
Okay, thank you.
Pronunciation is important.
Did I pronounce Moira's name correctly?
Yes. Moira, yes, I have to admit, probably a little bit of Moira's correcting everyone's pronunciation comes from when I was a kid. Nobody knew how to pronounce Alyssa or Sheinmel. I was Alicia, I was Lisa, I was Melissa half the time. So I'm sure some of that I channeled into Moira.
I was wondering about that. And I noticed that, yeah, she that was a good name though. One of my favorite characters from TV is Moira. So reading this book, I read it as an ARC and I was so excited about it. I was thrilled to read it, but it gave me a vibe of the 12 Dancing Princesses meets Girl Interrupted. So could you kind of tell us about the book and what inspired you to meld those two stories together?
Well, first, it's so funny that you say, because that was actually my pitch when I was writing it, it's the 12 Dancing Princesses meets Girl Interrupted. That's how I described it to my agent, my editor. So I'm glad that was an accurate pitch. And I've always loved the 12 Dancing Princesses fairy tale. It's one of my favorites. I feel like it's one that's not quite as well known. I'm a huge fairy tale junkie just in general. And I always felt like it was kind of a metaphor for being a teen girl, that you're, in the case of the fairy tale, like your father, the girl's father is trying to control them, and yet they still find a way in the case of the original fairy tale, escaping to a magical castle to express themselves and be themselves in the most kind of, fully liberating way. And just in case people aren't familiar with the fairy tale, it's these 12 sisters who are princesses whose father locks them in at night. But every morning there are holes in the bottom of their shoes, and he doesn't understand how that happens. And what it is the girls sneak out every night despite having been locked in, and they sneak to a magical castle where they dance the night away. And they dance so much that it wears their shoes down so that they have holes in the bottom of their shoes. And eventually, I think the father hires a prince to find them and follow them, and he as a reward for following them to the magic castle, he gets to marry one of the princesses. But the part where the girls escape the controlling parent in order to be themselves in the most fully way possible, I just feel like every teenager, male and female, occasionally feels that way, that they need to get out from under someone's thumb, whether it's a controlling parent or a controlling world, and to express themselves in as much as they possibly can. And there's something with that image of just dancing so much that it bores holes into the bottom of your shoes that I think is so freeing.
Yeah, I do. I really felt that. I haven't thought of that until you mentioned it, but there is something about when the 12 dancing princesses are going out each night, there's just this little feeling of freedom that they're gaining, which is something that you're searching for a lot as a teenager.
And as a grown-up, I mean, the world is constantly trying to impose rules upon us, and I think we all kind of want to escape to a magic castle where we can be our truest self.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I have read some of your other books, and so it made me curious to ask you, why do you think it's important to write about girls that are troubled?
Well, I think we write about the things that are important to us. So just kind of as a writer in in the most selfish way, if I'm going to spend a year or several years working on a story, it has to be something that matters to me, right? Before I even, so I think we write about the things that are important to us because that is what's never going to be boring to us to work on over and over and over again. And when you write a book, you write it over and over and over again. So I think part of it is, mental health issues are important to me and are interesting to me, are important, I think we can never destigmatize them enough. I think we can never talk about these things enough. And the more we talk about them, the more we destigmatize them. So they're just what's important to me. And that's what I end up writing about. And I think, I just come up with these story ideas, and, I think if you're lucky enough to have an idea at all as a writer, because sometimes you have these dry spells where you're like, oh my God, I'm never going to get another new idea again. I think when you have an idea, you kind of go with it. And these are the ideas that I've been having. And again, I think it's because these are the things that are important to me.
So, okay, this question, I was talking about this with some of the teenagers here at our library, and we were really interested in the fact that your characters get backgrounds to kind of tell each of their stories. And can you talk a little bit about your motivation in doing that?
Well, I think when I was writing this book, I mean, so the book is principally told from the perspective of a character named Moira, and it's in most of the novel is in the first person from Moira's perspective, but she is at school with these 11 other girls, and throughout the book, there are 12 interludes from each of their perspectives. And I think part of the reason why I did that was because I think this book could have been narrated by any of them. Each of these girls has a story that could have been an entire book. I chose Moira as my way in, but each of these girls, just like every single person, has a story that could be an entire book. So it was important to me that each of them had a chance where we learned their story, because this book could have easily been told from the perspective of Raina or Cass or any of the girls. And I wanted to, and I think that's true in so many of the books I write. Occasionally I write books with multiple narrators, but even when I have a book with, one main character and only one narrator, the other characters in the book are equal, they all have their own stories. And I think this just gave me a chance to tell each of their stories. And this book could have belonged to any of them. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
So sorry, I was having
Okay.
trouble with that. Oh, I've read some of your other books, and I have to agree, like you really do a good job at that, at narrating giving them their stories. And I think it's nice that you gave them all their own story, because it just kind of encouraged me that like all of us have a story. So I really like that. And I have to plug your other books as well a little bit here. I really like the narration that you give in like A Danger to Herself and Others. It's just, if you are watching this and you have read Castle Schools for Troubled Girls, yeah, I have to plug that one as well. It's so good. And I just like, I love how you do like a really great job of doing some unreliable narration there, to where people are just kind of wondering exactly what the story is. And I noticed that in this book too. It's fun. It makes the book a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you so much. With The Danger Yourself and Others, that was kind of maybe it was the most fun voice to write. Hannah, the main character's name is Hannah. She is so different, I think, from anyone I've written before. She knows herself very well. She is very confident that she's the smartest person in every room. She doesn't suffer fools, and she kind of thinks that everybody but her is a fool. And she's complicated. And it's interesting because I think she falls under like the, problematic umbrella of unlikable female protagonist. I find her so incredibly likable that, even though she is, an abrasive character, but she just was, I certainly loved writing her. She's a complicated character, and she learns a lot through the course of the novel, but her voice really is singular. Like if that was a novel where it had, multiple narrators, you would have absolutely known the minute you were out of Hannah's head. Like that was one where we were never out of Hannah's head. We were always seeing things from her perspective.
For sure. You do a really good job with these characters of making them like full-fledged humans. Like they're so three-dimensional as you read. And can you talk a little bit about when you're writing, is that humanity something that you're doing purposely, or do they kind of speak to you as you're writing them?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I think, depending on the book, like with A Danger to Yourself and Others, before I knew exactly what the plot would be, I knew Hannah's voice. I knew exactly what she sounded like. I knew exactly who she was. And that kind of led the way. I think with the Castle School, I got to know Moira more the more that I wrote. I think, for example, one of Moira's sort of little character quirks is she loves trivia. It's how she keeps her mind busy when she's stressed about things. To calm herself down, she thinks about trivia. And when I first came up with the idea for the book, I didn't know that about Moira. And as I was writing, I knew that was something that developed as I wrote. And I think for each of the 12 girls, I took a step back and decided, what each of their little interludes and what each of their histories was going to be. So before I wrote most of the book, I had to, I wrote Moira's first couple chapters just kind of to figure out the world and her voice and all that. But then I stopped and said, I have to figure out the other 11 girls, and I need to know them just as well as I know Moira. Because like I said, I think this book could have been narrated by any of them. I mean, it obviously would have been a very different book, but I think that would just kind of be a blast to kind of see the story from another one of their perspectives, because they all have interesting backgrounds and distinct voices. And I needed to get to know them. And this book had more characters in it than most of my books have. Like this book had a real ensemble. Like, for example, A Danger to Yourself and Others, bless you. A Danger to Yourself and Others has about like 3 characters. This has the 12 girls plus, spoiler alert, 12 boys at another school, plus the professor, plus the professor's son, plus Moira's parents and Moira's best friend. Like there's so many more characters than I'm used to dealing with. So I needed to get to know them all before. So, I kind of came up with the premise for the book and Moira's voice, but then I had to stop and figure out who each of the other characters were before I could continue with the plot, because otherwise I would have had to go back and rewrite so much if I didn't know exactly who everyone was from the beginning.
So another question I had from some of the teens here, they were curious if like in the story, if you have a favorite character or a character that you relate to the most out of the story.
I mean, I don't know if I have a favorite. I really love Eleanor, like that's Moira's roommate at the school. I just always, from the beginning, she was of the other girls. She was the one I saw most clearly. Also, Cass was really clear to me from the very beginning. I knew exactly who Cass was. Like I have this picture in my head, even though this is not in the book, of what Cass's bedroom at home looks like what's on her walls. She seemed very clear to me, but I mean, I think Moira's love of trivia is something that she and I share. Like a lot of the trivia that she comes up with was not stuff that I had to look up. It was just stuff that I knew that I put in there. So that's something like I wouldn't say necessarily she and I are the same, but that trivia thing that was a little present for me because I love trivia.
I love that you didn't have to look that up. That is so cool.
I mean, some of it I did, but some of it was just like stuff I knew or stuff I knew I would like when she was on the plane in the beginning and going to Maine and started looking up the weather. I was like, well, that's what I would do. That is what I do when I take a trip. I stop and make sure I'm very familiar with all the weather patterns where I'm headed first.
That's awesome. That kind of leads into the next question, which was about trivia. So she's like obsessed with trivia. And it was part of her relationship with Nathan, and it seems to help her feel more attached to him. So can you talk about how she kind of is staying attached to her friend Nathan and kind of hearing him talking to her and things like that throughout the book?
I think, the premise of the book is that Moira's best friend Nathan has just recently passed away. And I think when we lose people who we're that close to, it's such a complicated thing. Grief is so deeply and terribly and horribly complicated. And I think, even though those people are gone, they very much don't feel gone. We still hear the voices in our heads. We still have conversations with them. My mother passed away recently, and I'm still constantly talking to her and thinking of the things that she would like and the things that we should be doing together and the conversations I should be having with her that I'm not. And I think, Moira is going through that with Nathan, which is so, interesting to me because I wrote this before I personally had lived it. And it's interesting to me how much of what I've gone through since I've lost my mother is so similar to what Moira's gone through with Nathan, this sort of continuing these conversations because they don't really end just because someone passed away. And I think the trivia is something that she and not even so much that something that she and Nathan shared, it's something Moira loved that never bugged Nathan. Because I think that's part of what makes the friendship that she had with Nathan so special is Moira thinks of herself as kind of, I'm not saying I think of Moira this way, but Moira thinks of herself as kind of a weird girl who didn't fit in with the other kids at school. And Nathan never held those quirks against her. He never minded that she was the kind of person who wanted to spend her vacation, like who wanted to go to Europe to tour libraries. He thought, that's great, you'll tour libraries, I'll tour schools, and we'll meet in the middle, like it'll be something we can enjoy together. He never said, oh, you're so weird that you want to tour libraries instead of, going shopping or going to museums. Why do you want to? He never judged her for that. He never judged her for loving trivia. And I think trivia became something in her grief that she could turn to when she felt herself, becoming overwhelmed by how much she missed this person in her life who never judged her. Not just the way that the other kids at school judged her, but she felt judged by her parents for being kind of a little bit weird. She felt like she had disappointed her mother by not being, one of the cool girls. And I think, when she feels her grief overwhelming her, she can reach for her phone and look up pieces of trivia, which is part of why it's so challenging for her. At the Catholic school, they don't allow devices, they don't allow internet access. So she isn't able to escape from her grief by looking these things up. And I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with allowing yourself an escape from your grief. I think it's great, but that is not the way that Dr. Prince runs his school. But I think it's something that forces her to then confront her grief, that she can't turn to her trivia, that she can't, turn to facts and figures and has to kind of be in her body and in her thoughts and in her emotions.
So it is interesting when you're talking about the grief, because I lost my dad too. And I felt like this was, thank you. And I'm sorry for your loss as well. But this book is just so on point on what it feels like to grieve a loved one. And there was so much in it that I felt like was helpful. So did you have to research grief and stuff like that for writing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, yes, I absolutely did a lot of research on grief. But I think one thing, unfortunately, about grief is that it is entirely universal if you love anything or anyone. And it's not exclusive to losing a person that you love. It can also be losing a part of your life, like, even things that you're looking forward to, graduating high school and going to college. You still have lost being in high school. There still can be a sense of loss, even with something you're thrilled to have happen. And certainly we've all experienced so much grief over the past few years with what's been going on in the world. And I think, the more that you come to understand how universal grief is and how many things we grieve, I think people think of grief and mourning as being associated with, when someone you love passes away, but you can grieve relationships that end, you can grieve, life events that end. And so, I did a lot of research, but it's also so deeply universal that, of course, it was something that I experienced. I had experienced in a million different ways. And, I think, like I said, when I lost my mom, when my mom passed away, it was, 2 years after I had finished writing this book. And I was really struck by how much Moira felt that I was feeling, that I didn't know at the time, and it's not as though I had never lost someone before my mom. She was just like the closest person of the people I had lost. And it really, I think, again, because grief is so deeply universal, we've all experienced it in a lot of ways that sometimes we don't recognize at the time. And we don't realize that I was grieving during that period, because we so look at it through this narrow window of it with the loss of a loved one, and it's not always.
I really liked how you also wrote about that there's no time limit, and that it's not you're going to feel it differently than maybe what other people expected. That was really good.
Yeah, it is so frustrating. There are like expectations that come with grief. I mean, especially there's, the sort of, in the popular lexicon is the idea of the 5 stages of grief, which is, by the way, just for everybody watching, the 5 stages of grief have been completely debunked. Every therapist says it's not a thing. So when you are grieving, don't expect your feelings or force your feelings to fit into that, into that paradigm, and then be disappointed in yourself when they don't. Because I think there is this idea that I'll go through these 5 stages and then my grief will be over. And grief never ends. We just learn to live with it. I think, it can come in waves. It certainly has times when it feels less and times when it feels more. But it never ends, because love doesn't end. And so whether the thing we loved was a person we lost or a part of our lives that ended, we still, if we still love that person, then we still grieve the loss of that person. That doesn't mean that our lives aren't happy and that we don't go on and have fulfilled wonderful lives with more love in them. But if you believe, as I believe, that grief is love, then of course that doesn't end, because love doesn't end. And of course there's no right way to love someone. So there's also no right way to grieve someone. So this notion of you're supposed to go through certain stages and get to the end and then it's over. And I think it really does a number on us that we think it's supposed to end. There is this idea that after a certain amount of time goes by, we're supposed to feel better and it's supposed to be over. And in the case of Moira, I think her parents send her to this school because they don't understand why her grief hasn't ended. They think, her best friend died. It was really sad. It was a few months ago. And she should be feeling better now, and she's not feeling better. And sometimes we don't, and I think that also gets us into trouble with the people around us having expectations about the form that our grief is supposed to take, not just that we ourselves put these rules on ourselves of what the grief is supposed to look like and feel like, and again, that it's supposed to end.
That kind of brings me to something that interested me about the book. So Moira is sent to the Castle School when it's called Castle School North, and then there's Castle School South. which has boys, and they're different. They're both run very differently. And I found it so interesting that the school was like helpful, but also problematic. Like, what is your opinion about the Castle School? Do you think it was good for Moira?
I think that the doctors running each of these schools, both of whom are named Dr. Prince, are doing it with the absolute best of intentions. They absolutely intend to help their students, and they believe that what they're doing is helpful. Whether or not being sent away was necessarily the best thing for Moira, I don't know. I think it would have been really nice for her if her parents had been more understanding. She could have stayed at home. But I do think what ended up being so good for her and so good for the other students there were the relationships they built with one another. I think, what ended up happening is this little community of these 12 students, particularly at Castle South, turned into almost a support group where it wasn't even necessarily Dr. Prince with whom they were doing their therapy, although of course they do, but it was really each other. Like for Moira in particular, to learn that there were other people out there who would accept her her quirky, weird self, and who would befriend her quirky, weird self was very healing, because part of what she was mourning when she lost Nathan wasn't just Nathan himself, but the idea that nobody else would ever love her or want to be her friend. Like, because until Nathan came along, she had never had a best friend. And so I think for all of the Castle School's flaws, one thing that it did very well was it did give Moira 11 dear friends. In fact, more than 11, really. Dear friends who don't judge her for being a little strange. They might make fun of her sometimes, they might roll their eyes at her, but they embrace her because they're all weirdos too. And I think, and frankly, we're all weirdos. I have never met someone in my life who's not a weirdo. Maybe there are some cool kids out there that have no weird quirks, I don't know. But I think that was one of the things Moira needed to understand. She thought nobody else was a weirdo but her and Nathan. And I think being trapped in this isolated school with 11 other girls in the middle of nowhere forced her to realize that, oh, like, we're all kind of weirdos. Everybody's a weirdo, and people will still love me even though I'm a weirdo.
So one of the teens here wanted me to ask you, what was your favorite genre to read? And then also, what you like to read, does that like kind of reflect what you write? Like, is that what you like to write as well?
I mean, I am not picky with my genres. I read a lot of everything. I will say when I was in high school, I really loved reading memoirs about, people, basically memoirs about people with mental health issues. Because when I was a teenager, there weren't a lot of young adult novels out there. There was a very few sort of young adult romance novels in Sweet Valley High and things like that. So if I wanted to read about people whose experience kind of resembled people that I knew in real life, because Sweet Valley High in no way, shape, or form resembled anybody I knew in real life, I ended up picking up memoirs like Prozac Nation and Wasted. These are books that I'm sure by today's standards are pretty dated, but at the time, those were the stories that I could read about people my age, because there weren't a lot of novels out there about people my age. So I think it was those books in a lot of ways that made me want to write this kind of fiction, because I was like, they made me believe that people are interested in hearing stories about, young, in particular women, but not just women, young people of all genders going through mental health issues. Because prior to reading those books, that was not something that I had read about in reading novels. And now there's a lot of those sorts of novels out there, for which I'm very grateful. But I think, when I was in high school, those were the books that I gravitated towards. But I read a lot of everything. Like I read a lot of, I just finished a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is such an incredible book, but it's, basically a textbook about trauma. But for me, first of all, it's deeply interesting, but it's also, reading books like that, the better that I understand people, I think it helps me write. The better that I understand things like trauma and different mental health issues, I think it helps me as a writer. And what else am I reading? Yeah, I read a lot. I read pretty much, I read across genres. I love women's fiction. I love memoir. I love fantasy. I kind of am an equal opportunity reader.
Yeah, as soon as you said you just finished The Body Keeps the Score, my first thought was, oh, wow, I can't wait to see what you write next now.
Oh my God. That book,
so good.
I mean, I have to tell you, like, I guess it's a long book and I read it really slowly because I like flagged half of it and then went back and reread things. But the people, my best friend and my husband, like the two people with whom I spend the most time, had to basically listen for the 2 weeks that I was reading this book, had to listen to me like giving them a book report on the book endlessly. So they were very patient as I like went back to something I flagged, read it out loud, and then discussed it with them, and then we had to discuss it with each other.
I do that to my husband too. He said he doesn't read, but he feels like he gets it all from me. Okay, something that really interested me in the book was there comes a time, I don't want to give out too many spoilers here, but there comes a point in time where Moira is faced with the decision of telling Dr. Prince that her friend might be in danger. I don't want to explain exactly what happens, so anybody, if you haven't read it yet, but that really, I found that to be such a poignant part of the book, because working with teens, I know that knowing when to go to an adult or an authority figure is such a hard thing to decide. So can you kind of talk about what it was like writing that chapter and just what Moira was going through and like what you felt her going through as you wrote it?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult because especially in Moira's case, she'd previously gone to an adult this was for her friend Nathan. Again, I don't want to give any spoilers, but she'd previously gone to an adult and had it go badly. And so it's very hard for her to believe that it's the right thing to do, to go to an adult and ask for help. And I think, I don't know, this is never not a difficult decision for a kid or a teen, because first of all, you might go to an adult who doesn't help at all, who makes things worse, or who says, oh, you're, worried about nothing, that's nothing. And both of those, like whether they overreact, both being overreaction and underreaction are so disorienting for the person who's reporting this thing, whatever it is. Both of those things can be so harmful. And I think for Moira, to have to trust an adult when she kind of never trusted anybody but her best friend who passed away, and who had been let down, like the adults in her life before she'd gotten to the Castle School, her parents let her down. Like her mother and father didn't understand how profound the loss of Nathan was. And so she really doesn't trust adults to understand her at all. And so I think it was a really difficult decision for her, and she really agonized over it. But ultimately, I think what she came to understand is that the decision she'd made in the past when she went to an adult for Nathan actually had been the right decision. It just didn't feel like it was. And I think she knew this time around it was the right thing to ask for help. Because, I mean, I would hope that asking for help is always the right decision, but I know we don't always have safe people to ask for help. But if we do have safe people to ask for help, then we should never be ashamed of asking for help. Oh, you're muted again.
I'm so sorry. You're so fast. Everything you're saying is so interesting. I forget that I'm muted. I mentioned that you had the unreliable narrator in A Danger to Herself and Others. And it's interesting to me how Moira is an unreliable narrator to herself, because she's got this idea of what's happened with her situation with Nathan and what all happened with losing her friend. And she's telling herself that all this is going on, and she's actually wrong on some of the ways. And I found it really interesting that she saw herself as being a disappointment to her mother and just embarrassment, when it was interesting to learn her mother was scared.
I think it's so interesting. I hadn't put it quite this way until you said it, that she's kind of an unreliable narrator for herself. But I think like so many of us are unreliable narrators to ourselves. Like we, we have this voice in our head that tells us things that we've done wrong, that tells us things that are our fault, that tells us people are disappointed in us. And, just in Moira's case, obviously we get to see it on the page, but she has been beating herself up and telling herself these stories about the things she's done wrong and the people who don't love her for so long. And I think it is just like such a terribly sad thing when you put it that way. Like we kind of all have an unreliable narrator in our head telling a version of our story that is so not true. And I think, the work of learning not to listen to that unreliable narrator is, the work of a lifetime. Like, and, there are a million self-help books, I'm sure, written about not listening to that unreliable narrator. There was something I read recently that like, I can't remember. Oh, I think the book is called The Untethered Soul. But anyway, it was like a self-helpy kind of book that talked about like the voice in our head is like a bad roommate, and like why would you would kick that roommate out, but we allow ourselves, but we live with this person constantly, and we allow that person to be in our heads. And I do think poor Moira is living with that person, but I think the alternative to listening to that voice for her is sitting in her grief. And as much as that voice hurts her by telling her that what happened with Nathan, that she's to blame for what happened with Nathan, that she that no one will ever be her friend again, that her mother doesn't love her. As painful as that voice is, it is less painful to her, or at least less frightening to her, than sitting with how much she misses Nathan. Because sitting with self-blame and self-hate is less difficult for her than sitting with her sadness over her life.
I think that's one of the most important parts of this book is that her grief is so raw. Like just like talking to you about it and hearing you describe it, I can feel it. That raw pain you get, when you're going through grief yourself, and you can feel that with Moira as you read the book. She learns about radical acceptance. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, radical acceptance is something I've read about a lot, and it really resonated with me when I read about it. That radical acceptance is just, so the kind of theory behind radical acceptance is that so much of the pain that we feel in our lives is resisting what's true. So when something happens that we didn't want to happen, it's our instinct to say, I wish that hadn't happened. If only I had done this, that's not fair. But in that space where we are focused on wishing that it hadn't happened, we're causing more pain than if we simply accepted that that's what happened. Radical acceptance isn't saying there's nothing we can do to change things that are bad. Like certainly we should fight to change things that are bad, but it is to start from a place where we accept that this is what is. So, in Moira's case, my best friend died, and she has been spending so much time thinking about all the things that happened leading up to his death, and all her regrets about the things that happened leading up to his death, which is really her wanting to be able to replay those days. And she will never be able to replay those days or redo those days in any way. She has to start from a place where she accepts Nathan is gone. This is what is. That doesn't mean she doesn't miss him terribly. Part of what is that she has to accept is, and now I miss him terribly. Like that's part of the this that she has to accept. This is what is. My best friend is gone. I miss him terribly. Nothing I can do can change that. So all I can do is accept that that's the case. But we're so hardwired to be like, but he was young, he was vital, he shouldn't have died. And of course those things are true, but thinking that just prolongs our pain.
So I had a lot of places that were flagged, and there was this one, I can't find it now, but there's a line in it where she's told something to along the lines of, that Nathan was what saw the good in her, but maybe she should see that herself, that Nathan was what believed that she was okay and that she was worthy. And she should have felt that, she needs to learn to feel that herself. And this comes near to the time she learns about radical acceptance. So do you think that that kind of self-identification, that goes along with radical acceptance?
I don't know. I mean, I think part of what makes the losing Nathan so profound is that this was someone who accepted her entirely. And so, part of being accepted by someone else, of course, like it makes us feel validated when someone else accepts us, but it doesn't necessarily make it easier for us to accept ourselves. So I think for Moira, part of the struggle is, and especially because she feels like she disappoints her mother, she feels like everybody else doesn't like her and only Nathan liked her. So his acceptance was very validating, but it also kind of made her believe that nobody else would ever accept her, let alone her. So I think, she has to learn to accept herself with or without Nathan, which I think, like I said, I think that's like the work of a lifetime. And I imagine Moira will struggle with that for the rest of her lives the way everybody does. But it certainly is, profoundly, it is extraordinary when you find someone who accepts you exactly as you are. And I think, that's what makes the loss so extraordinary for Moira.
So do you think that there is another story, The Castle School for Boys?
I mean, I think this world could lend itself to so many stories. I really love both of these schools. I think there's so many characters and possibilities. So I think there are more stories to be told. I don't know if I will ever get to tell them, but certainly they exist in my imagination for sure.
Oh, sorry. I lost my train of thought here.
Oh, no worries.
Can you talk a little bit about Eleanor and there's a lot of elements in the book that talk about her with the self-harm can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, Eleanor's character, so Eleanor is Moira's roommate at the castle school, and she engages in self-harm. And she has a long history of self-harm. And I think, and unfortunately, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, because I also write about self-harm in my book, What Kind of Girl? And the more that I research self-harm, the more I feel like we need to be talking about this more and more and more. And I'm so sorry, I can't remember the exact numbers, but the numbers of young people who engage in self-harm are staggeringly high, like just, astonishingly high. And it can take place in so many different forms. I mean, the one that we're most kind of familiar with is, we think about people cutting themselves, but there are so many different ways that people engage in different sorts of hurting themselves. And it was just important to me to write a character to contribute to this conversation, because I think the more we can destigmatize this, the more that we can talk about it, the more that we can kind of take it out of the darkness, because it is one of those things that is inherently kept secret. Like so many other mental health issues. I mean, like anorexia, bulimia, which are really also forms of self-harm, and come from a lot of the same places. So I think it was just important to me to write this character who is, and I think it was also important to write a character who is so many other things. I think sometimes when we write characters with mental health issues, we don't always see them also being like fun and funny and sharp and witty, and Eleanor is more than just her mental health issue. Like, she does have this, this difficulty, but she's also so many things. And she's also a lot of fun. She's funny, she's adventurous, she's smart, she falls in love over the course of the novel. She has so much to offer. And I think for her also, there's something healing about having these friends in this place where nobody judges her for having for the fact that she has mental health issues. They all adore her anyway, and not anyway, like they adore her and they embrace that. They understand that about her, because they know what it is to kind of hate yourself and want to hurt yourself.
Hannah is another character that just does not suffer fools. and I'm glad you brought up the humor in the book, because this book is actually very funny, and it's crazy that a book that is so serious, there's so many serious topics in it, could be this humorous. Does that come naturally?
I mean, I will tell you, just in my own personal experience, like some of the most deeply sad moments in my life were also kind of hilariously funny. I think that often happens. Like, and for me, like going back to when I was young, I remember the movies and TV shows that I thought did the best job dealing with grief or, you know, any sort of difficult, heavy issues were the ones that also imbued it with a great deal of humor, because that was what my real life reflected. Like, I still remember to this day, the first time I ever went to a funeral. I was a senior in high school. One of my classmates had passed away, and I couldn't tell you what it was, but somebody told a joke, and it was just like one of the funniest moments of my life. Or, you know, at my mother's funeral last year, we had these moments of humor during the service where we were cracking up. Just in my life, some of the saddest moments have always had humor. And I think, you know, I know not everybody necessarily has had that experience, but I do think, like, to me, the portrayals of grief and loss that ring the truest are the ones that also have a great deal of humor in them.
You brought up that it was hard to find young adult books when you were younger, and that really rings true with me. We were talking here about books that we read in high school, and I realized we didn't have any young adult books. Do you feel like that we're doing better at providing a lot of great young adult books? And do you think you'll stick with writing young adults and making books for that age, or do you think you'll move on to different?
I mean, well, one, I think absolutely the world of YA has grown so enormously in the last couple of decades, and particularly I think in the last, you know, 5-10 years, and it's just more and more reflective of people's real life experiences, and it's also more and more reflective of outrageous, extraordinary experiences. And you know, I think you know, some of the best literature that is being written out there falls under the YA world, and it really is exciting, and it's an exciting time to be a YA reader and a YA writer. And you know, I have every intention, as long as people want to keep publishing me, I have every intention of continuing to write for teens. I think the books that I read as a teen, you know, stay with you, or stayed with me in a way that, you know, very little other reading has. Like, and it's such a special thing to get to be a part of someone, you know, to think that someone is reading my books the way that I read books at that age. So yeah, as long as you'll have me, this is what I'm writing. I mean, and I'll never say never, because like I said, I like reading such diverse genres that, you know, maybe someday I'll write in other genres, but I love doing this kind of writing.
What tips do you have for young people out there that are feeling like they want to write when they are an adult?
I mean, I think my number one piece of advice is always to just read as much as you possibly can. I genuinely believe, and I know it's kind of a cliche, that every single thing I've ever read has taught me something about how to write a book. I mean, essays and textbooks have taught me how to write a book. Like, I actually, speaking of injecting humor, my favorite textbook in college was a psych textbook where it was a very dry psychology textbook, and the author had injected humor every so often, and I still remember, like, I've memorized lines from that textbook because they were so funny. So I think, you know, every single type of writing that I've gotten to read has taught me something about how to tell a story. And then I think the other piece of advice that I was given by one of my favorite professors in college was, you know, I think read every genre, everything will teach you something. But one thing he said that always stayed with me was read someone who writes what you want to write, but does it better. Which first of all means having no ego about the fact, like, of course there are people who do it better than you do. So you have no ego about that. You in fact are seeking that out. You are seeking out writers who do the kind of writing you want to do and do it better. And there's no one better to teach you than the sort of writers who do the kind of writing you want to do but do it better.
So when you went into becoming a writer, was it something that you always knew you were?
I always wanted to be a writer. I was very lucky to have a very, you know, wonderful job for a lot of years. I worked in the marketing department at Random House Children's Books, and my first few books were published while I still worked there. And I really thought that I would work there forever, but eventually I realized that to do, you know, kind of work I wanted to do, I couldn't quite do both. But But no, I always wanted to be a writer from a very young age. Like I think as soon as I realized that was a way that could be a job, because I was that kid who walked around with notebooks and wrote stories down for fun. I don't remember exactly how old I was when I realized some people did that as a job. I just thought that was like what you did for fun.
Oh, we have a question. What are some of those lines from the psych textbook?
The one I remember was about praying mantises. But I don't know if it's really appropriate.
Oh, you're going to make us all even more curious.
Yeah, I don't know if it's appropriate, but he made a very good joke about praying mantises that was really about like reflexes in the brain and, was something to know about, for psychology, but was also very funny about how praying mantises reproduce.
Okay. So that'll give our listeners a new trivia to go look at.
But I mean, I will say, in all seriousness, that textbook taught me something about how to put humor in an otherwise very serious, subject. And so I think, and like I said, a lot of like movies and TV shows that I grew up with did that also. But even a textbook can teach you something about how to write a story.
And I feel like that might be part of the reason why your characters just seem so fleshed out. They had Moira, she's experiencing so many human truths like grief and humor and the feeling of need to measure up for her mother.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing that like grief and joy can coexist. It's really a strange, like, you can be in very deep grief and also be experiencing new things that bring you joy. And that, for Moira, like she's never going to stop grieving Nathan, but she has to allow herself to also experience joy in her life. And I think she has this desire to freeze her life at the point where Nathan was still in it, because she doesn't want to, I think she feels guilty experiencing joy without him. But it's kind of, I think she learns, I hope, by the end of the novel that she can continue to grieve him and respect him and love him while also experiencing joy.
Moira's conversations with Dr. Prince, they just seem so natural that reading it to me felt therapeutic. When you wrote those conversations, what kind were you specifically going for that?
I mean, I think, like I said, I did quite a bit of research on radical acceptance because it's so interesting to me. So I wanted to try to portray him as a therapist who was, espousing this theory. And, but I wanted to portray him as an adult who was, no matter what Moira said or did, he wasn't judging her. Because I think, hopefully a good therapist will also never kind of judge you. They will treat you, but they won't, issue judgment for things that you might say. And I think it was important to me that Moira was in a room where she felt that she wasn't being judged. And I think, in terms of trusting someone, whether it's a therapist or a parent or a friend, like the number one thing that a person can do to kind of earn your trust is not to judge you. They can have opinions and they can certainly advise, but if you know that like you'll tell them like your deepest, darkest secret and they won't be like, oh my God, you're awful. Like they won't judge you.
So what do you think Moira goes on to do with her life?
My goodness, I don't know. I would love it if she ended up being like a history professor or something. That would indulge her trivia for her love of trivia forever. I hope she is somebody who gets to stay in school and just keep gathering more degrees and learning more facts. I think she'd be very happy doing that.
She would. And do you feel like if you could have Dr. Prince as a therapist, would you want him as a therapist?
Ooh. I mean, like I said, I'm not entirely sure I agree with his methods of like isolating 12 girls in the wilderness. But I also think he really prides himself on creating a safe space for his patients. And he understands that they come from homes where they didn't feel safe, and whether they didn't feel safe, emotionally because they felt like their parents were judging them, or if they physically weren't safe, he feels like it's his job to create a safe space. And that probably is the best thing a therapist could do. So yes, I think he's a good therapist. I think.
I agree. Of course, yes, also problematic, but otherwise
But he truly comes from a place of wanting to help his patients and his students. And I think, that's always his intention.
I found it really interesting, the whole idea of magic being behind what was happening at the school too. Like the girls questioning that in a way, that was
in a very early draft of the novel, there actually was like a magical element that did not work and didn't stay in the book. But I did have this idea that maybe there was going to be magic at the other castle, kind of going back to that fairy tale. So I didn't want, because the story has, some roots in a magical fairy tale world, I didn't want to completely, I wanted to have some hints of magic in there.
You did a great job. As a reader, I was so torn for a bit, wondering. And I kept counting the girls as they came in. I'm like, is this the 12 dancing princesses?
All right, everyone. I think that we are kind of nearing the end of our time here. So that was a really fantastic panel. Alyssa, could you please tell us the author of that psych textbook? Because I think some of our watchers on YouTube were really wanting to get their hands on that textbook.
The textbook, it was Gleitman. I can't remember his first name, but I didn't go to UPenn, but he was professor at UPenn. I was at Barnard. And I remember he was a professor there at the time who had written this textbook. His last name, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Gleitman. It still is a textbook. It's like one of my dear possessions. My dog actually chewed up the spine of it, and I was very upset because I love this textbook.
That's great. So thank you so very much, Rachel and Alyssa. That has been an awesome panel, very interesting, very enjoyable, and easy to listen to. So thank you so much for participating. I greatly appreciate your time and your attention today. And audience, thank you so much for watching and being with us today. I hope that you have enjoyed yourself. Please don't forget to vote for your favorite Elliot Rosewater title on this year's list, audience. I want to remind you that voting is online at rosiebookaward.com. That's ROSIE bookaward.com. And today is only the first of our author panels for this year's RosieCon Book Festival. And our next panel is going to be in 2 weeks. I will share my screen to bring up that particular flyer for that panel. So the next panel is going to be with Natalie Richards, and her Rosewater title on this year's list is 5 Total Strangers. So we're staying with sort of the spooky and the horror fiction, the thriller stuff for the month of October, which is fantastic. And our moderator for that panel in 2 weeks will be Leslie Brenner, another public librarian. So no, I'm so sorry. Leslie is actually a school librarian. So that's who will be moderating and the author for our next panel in 2 weeks. So remember that registration for our panels are always free, and all you have to do is go to the book festival website and you can register through Zoom. When you register through Zoom, you can then ask questions with the Q&A button that's at the bottom of the screen. If you live stream through YouTube, you can always ask questions through the comments within YouTube. So videos can be shared after today, teachers and educators and librarians in your classroom and at your leisure for whatever time frame is convenient for you after today. So as soon as we end today's session, it will be available for re-showing within the YouTube channel. So everyone, please stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful rest of your night. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.